Today, Dr. Luke reports for us the very first sermon that Peter ever preached. And while it may not score that high by the rules of hermeneutics, it was an effective speech. And in fact, in reading through what Peter said, it was much better than the first sermon I ever gave. As I reflect back, I do remember how that went. You see, the pastor of the church where I belonged was planning to be gone on a particular Sunday, and he needed someone to fill in for him. And why he decided to pick on me, I will never know, but he asked me to fill the pulpit for him on that Sunday. Now, have you ever been asked to do something and you just never really thought about it, whether you were busy or focused on something else? You just said, oh, sure, I'll do it. And then 2 seconds later, it finally dawned on you what you agreed to do. And then you thought to yourself, what in the blank did I do that for? What was wrong with me? Well, that was kind of my situation. You see, I was active in the church. I even sang in the choir. I had never done, though, any public speaking before. And I made it clear, I thought that I really wasn't interested in doing any public speaking. Yet he was asking me to preach. Well, right afterwards, right after I said, okay, I can do that, I got to thinking, gee whiz, I don't know the first thing about putting together a sermon. And I'm not even sure how to even begin. But since I had several weeks to prepare, I called on my pastor to help me, and he was very willing to do so. And there were several other church folks who were willing to do that as well. And I called upon them. I chose a topic. I studied related scriptures. I read Bible commentaries and study guides. I listened to sermons on the radio, and I was much more attentive to my own pastor when he preached than I had probably ever been in the past. When that faithful day arrived, I got out of bed very early for a Sunday. I went over and over what I had written and then went over it again, every time making little changes. I had a hard time focusing on the other things that was going on in church that morning, on the singing or the praying or anything much else, as I anticipated that moment when I would be expected to stand up and preach. I kept remembering all those preacher jokes, people had told me over the years. Like the one about the little boy who walks up to the preacher as he's leaving the church with the dollar bill in his hand, and as he shakes the preacher's hand, he holds it out to the preacher as he leaves and says, my daddy gave me this to buy a soda with, but I think you should have it. A bit surprised, the pastor says, well, thank you. That's very generous of you, son, but why do you think I need it? Because my daddy said that you are the poorest preacher we've ever had in this church. Then there's the one about the man who sets up an appointment with his doctor to try to do something about his loud snoring. He tells the doctor, Doc, as soon as I go to sleep, I start to snore. At least that's what my wife tells me. She says I get really loud. So the doctor says, well, does this snoring of yours bother your wife and keep her awake? Why, yes, it does, the man says, and it also bothers all the other folks sitting in the pews around us. Now, with these things running through my head, I stood up to preach. You see, the lay leader had been running the service, and Then he announced that the guest speaker for today was going to be me. So I slowly and stiffly walked up to the pulpit and I said, "Good morning," and there was hardly any response from the congregation. Then I proceeded to drop my notes and they scattered on the floor, and I became acutely aware of that uncomfortable feeling when every eye in the room is on you. And I fought the urge to just walk out the door. And while the congregation waited, I retrieved my notes from off the floor and I composed myself and I began to speak. And as I remember it, that sermon lasted all of about 7 minutes. I started off just fine with my notes in hand. And then a story suddenly popped into my head out of nowhere, so I told it. Lost my place. Skipped a bunch of what I had written down because, well, when I picked up my notes, I got them all out of order and I could never find my place. Allowed several very awkward pauses, but somehow I managed to end on a fairly positive note. As is usually the case with church folks, they responded with a lot of grace and they gave me a lot of encouraging words afterward. As I look back now, I think it was because I had just done something that most of them would not try themselves. And they were praising me for my willingness to stand up and do something that most of them would never do, even if it wasn't all that good. Bishop William Willman says that a first sermon is a lot like a first date. You want to do well. Be impressive. Put your best foot forward. And try not to say anything really dumb that might endanger your future relationship with that person. But it can be a struggle because we preachers remember all too well the struggles that we have with our own weaknesses. And we all remember all the times we have failed to live up to Christian standards in our own lives. We preachers are also reminded that we are not any more qualified than anyone else to speak for God, regardless of our experiences and our educational level. Still to this day, when I step into a pulpit, I still get a bit nervous, wondering how I came to be standing here with the Word of God on my lips. Yes, everyone must have a few significant firsts in their careers, though. I mean, think about it. Every baker must decorate that first big wedding cake. Every lawyer must give that first closing argument in court. And every surgeon must perform their very first surgery. But of course, in that case, you never want to be the one that is in the room going under the anesthesia while the surgeon says, "Oh, you're my first one." Likewise, every preacher has gone through the experience of preaching their first sermon. Even Peter, as we see in our lesson today. And as I said, it's recorded for us right here in Acts. Now, we might think that Peter was, well, not very well qualified to preach. After all, he was formerly just a fisherman. He had little formal training or education. However, what he did have was much more important than any seminary degree. He had first-hand experience with Jesus. And there's one thing that is true of all of us, though. If we're only looking for faults in a person, we're sure to find them. And Peter had plenty of them. For instance, Peter wasn't exactly known for thinking about what he was going to say before he said it. When Jesus invited him to walk on the water with him, his lack of faith caused him to sink. When Jesus needed his prayerful support the most in the garden before his arrest, Peter fell asleep. When Jesus allowed himself to be arrested peacefully, Peter chose to react with violence, cutting off the ear of a servant. And perhaps his weakest moment, after boldly stating that he would follow Jesus even unto death, he would deny Jesus. He would deny that he even knew Jesus 3 times, just as Jesus predicted that he would. If you were tasked with finding the best qualified person to deliver the very first sermon that was designed to tell people about Jesus Christ, given his past performance, you would not likely call upon Peter. But over and over again, even considering my own situation, I am reminded that God often doesn't call the qualified. Rather, he qualifies the called. The first thing God often looks at is not our qualifications, but our availability. Although Peter was a bit impetuous and had plenty of other faults, he had spent the last 3 years with Jesus and knew the truth about who Jesus was. Therefore, he could tell others about his experience firsthand. And that's better than any theologian. So on the day of Pentecost, Peter stood up and began to speak. The way he began his sermon, though, wasn't the greatest. I mean, what would you think of me if I stepped into the pulpit and the way I began was by saying, really, folks, I'm not drunk this morning. Just want you to know that. It's only 9 o'clock. That's not really the best intro, I don't think, is it? But then he recovers fairly well because he brings in Scripture. He begins to quote the prophet Joel, which is something that should be at the heart of any good sermon. And Peter begins to tell about what he witnessed and then to interpret those events for his readers so they would understand the significance of who Jesus was and what he accomplished. Peter told them that Jesus' enemies had done what he had done in an attempt to try to get rid of him. But God used those events to fulfill his promise of salvation to all of creation. This meant that anyone who believed in Jesus and in the resurrection would be saved. This meant that the power of sin and even death itself had been broken. Then he uses other scriptures in his sermon. The resurrection of Jesus had already been predicted by David in Psalm 16, which Peter uses to support his claim. David wasn't writing about himself, Peter says. People still go and visit David's tomb, and his body is still there. But Jesus' tomb is empty. This was a fulfillment of David's prophecy, that one of his descendants would sit on David's own royal throne. That is, one who was not abandoned to the grave, nor will you let your Holy One see decay. My mic shut off, didn't it? Is this one? I'll try to speak up and finish. This is Peter's triumphal conclusion to his message. This Jesus God raised up, and all of us are witnesses, verse 32. The one who was crucified is now exalted at the right hand of God. If you read Peter's sermon, all the way through, it takes only about 5 minutes. It's very likely that in a lot of our churches today, if a preacher only preached sermons that lasted for 5 minutes instead of 20 or 30, the board would probably suggest docking their pay. But on the other hand, they might offer him a pretty good raise. I guess it all depends on which way your appreciation was flowing at the time. Come to think of it, I have yet to remember anyone who complained that my sermon was too short. Anyway, Peter's first sermon was a good one. And it boils down to the gospel message. He boils it down into just a few short lines which we preachers use in our own sermons all the time. It's simple, and it acknowledges a few facts. That Jesus was crucified, that he was raised from the dead, and that now he lives. The gospel records for us the first-hand accounts of the people who witnessed these events. And Jesus left this world. When he did so, he gave his followers a very simple command. Go and tell. Go and tell others what you have seen, what you've experienced. Tell others your story, just like Peter did. Tell others about your experience with God. And there isn't a person here this morning who is not qualified to do exactly that. Tell others about your experience with God. Remember that God does not call the qualified. God qualifies the called. And by the way, you are all called. Let's pray. Loving God, there are many firsts in our lives. As Christians, we all have a responsibility to tell others about our experience with you. Lord, many of us are very timid and we fail to do this. But give us the courage, especially in this Easter season where there is so much good news that we can share with others. Help us to muster up the courage to just tell others our story